Welcome to our channel. Today we're breaking down one cold case. A young woman vanishes on a Caribbean vacation, and it takes 18 years, a second murder, and a shocking confession to finally learn the truth about what really happened to her. Let's start. An 18-year-old girl leaves a nightclub on a small Caribbean island, laughing, getting into a car with three young men she barely knows. She is never seen again. Her suitcase stays packed. Her passport stays in her hotel room. Her flight home leaves without her. For the next 18 years, her disappearance will become one of the most talked about missing person cases in American history. Hundreds of volunteers will search the island. Dutch Marines will join the effort. Fighter jets will scan the coastline from above. Divers will comb the ocean floor. None of it will find her. The man everyone believes is responsible will be arrested and released. Arrested again, years later, and released again. He will offer her own mother a devastating trade, money in exchange for the truth, and then admit, once the money is in his hands, that he made the whole thing up. He will go on, eventually, to kill another young woman in a completely different country, almost to the very same date on the calendar. He will sit in a foreign prison for over a decade, protected the entire time by the simple fact that nobody can prove in a court of law exactly what he did on that Caribbean beach. And then, 18 years after she vanished, in a courtroom thousands of miles from where it all began, brought there not by the original crime, but by an entirely different one, he will finally say it out loud. This is the story of Natalee Holloway and the confession her family spent 18 years waiting to hear. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe. We cover real cold cases every week, cases where the truth waited years, sometimes decades, to surface, and where court records, sworn testimony, and official statements eventually tell us exactly what happened, no matter how long the wait. And if you're already subscribed, tap that like button. It helps this story reach more people who only remember the headlines from 2005 and never heard how it actually ended. Now, back to the island of Aruba, May of 2005. Natalee Ann Holloway was born on October 21st, 1986, and grew up in Mountain Brook, Alabama, a suburb of Birmingham. By the spring of 2005, Natalee was 18 years old, a straight-A student, and a recent graduate of Mountain Brook High School, a well-regarded school in one of Birmingham's more affluent suburbs. She had been accepted into the University of Alabama's pre-med program, with plans to eventually attend medical school and become a doctor. Friends and family described her as driven, outgoing, and well-liked, the kind of student teachers remembered fondly, even years later. To celebrate finishing high school, Natalee joined 124 of her classmates on a 5-day graduation trip to Aruba, a small island in the Dutch Caribbean, known for its beaches, its nightlife, and its popularity as a vacation destination for American high schoolers celebrating the end of the school year. It was meant to be one last carefree trip together before the group scattered to different colleges across the country that fall. The group arrived on the island on May 26, 2005. For 4 days, it was exactly the kind of trip it was supposed to be. Sun, beaches, nightclubs, and a group of newly graduated teenagers enjoying a few final days together before heading off to different colleges in the fall. Natalee was scheduled to fly home on May 30th, 2005. She never boarded that flight. On the night of May 29th into the early morning of May 30th, 2005, the final full night of the trip, Natalee Holloway went out with her classmates to a bar and nightclub called Carlos and Charlie's in Oranjestad, the capital of Aruba, a popular late-night spot with the American tourist crowd that filled the island every graduation season. There she met a 17-year-old Dutch student named Joran van der Sloot, along with 2 brothers, Deepak Kalpo, then 21, and Satish Kalpo, then 18. The 3 young men were locals, familiar faces around the island's nightlife scene, well known to bartenders, tourists, and other regulars at the club circuit in Oranjestad. Classmates who were still with Natalee earlier that night later told investigators she seemed to be having a good time, mixing easily with the group and enjoying one of her last nights before returning home. Nobody in her circle of friends raised any concern when she left with Vandersloot and the Calpo brothers. It was, by every account, an ordinary decision on an ordinary night of a graduation trip. In the early hours of May 30th, witnesses saw Natalie leave the bar with Vandersloot and the Calpo brothers. According to the account the three men would give police, they drove to the California lighthouse near Arashi Beach on the northwest tip of the island to watch sharks in the water, before driving Natalie back to her hotel, the Holiday Inn, and dropping her off at around 2 o'clock in the morning. That was the last confirmed sighting of Natalie Holloway. When Natalie failed to show up for her flight home later that day, her classmates and chaperones initially assumed she had simply overslept or lost track of time. It was only as the boarding time for the flight came and went, with no sign of her anywhere near the airport, that panic began to set in among the group. Chaperones checked her hotel room, hoping to find her still asleep or getting ready in a rush. Instead, they found something that made the situation immediately alarming. Her suitcase was still packed. Her passport was still inside. Nothing about her belongings suggested she had ever planned to miss her flight voluntarily. Whatever had happened to Natalie, it was clear she had never made it back to that room at all. With Natalie not yet officially classified as a missing person, a group of roughly 100 tourists and local residents began searching the immediate area almost right away, unwilling to wait for the situation to become more official before acting. Word spread quickly through the small island community. Within days, the search expanded dramatically. Aruban police, Dutch Marines, FBI agents, and eventually 3 F-16 fighter jets from the Netherlands, equipped with search technology, joined the effort. Volunteer search teams flew in from Texas. Specially trained search dogs combed the island's rugged volcanic terrain. Divers and sonar equipment were eventually deployed starting on June 25th to search the surrounding waters, an effort organized in part by volunteers rather than official government resources alone. Not one piece of physical evidence turned up. No body, no clothing, no confirmed trace of Natalie Holloway anywhere on the island or in the water surrounding it. For a search this large, involving this many trained personnel and this much specialized equipment, the total absence of any evidence at all was, in its own way, almost as unsettling as anything investigators could have found. Natalie Holloway's disappearance did not stay a local Alabama story for long. Within days, it had become a fixture of national cable news coverage in the United States, with several networks dedicating nightly segments to updates from the island, interviews with Natalie's family, and analysis from legal experts speculating on what might have happened. The intensity of that coverage brought both help and complications. On one hand, it kept pressure on Aruban authorities to continue investigating a case involving a foreign tourist, long after local interest might otherwise have faded. On the other, it turned Joran Vandersloot and the Calpo brothers into instantly recognizable faces around the world, long before any of them had ever been convicted of anything at all, a level of public presumption of guilt that would follow Vandersloot for the rest of his life, deserved or not. For Natalie's parents, Beth Holloway and Dave Holloway, the sudden global spotlight meant grieving their daughter's disappearance while simultaneously becoming public figures overnight, fielding interview requests and press conferences even as they still had no real answers about what had happened to her. As investigators pressed Vandersloot and the Calpo brothers for more detail, a strange thread emerged in their account. They claimed a hotel security guard had approached Natalie outside the Holiday Inn as they dropped her off, and that this guard, not them, had been the last person to see her. Vandersloot even offered at one point to lead investigators directly to the guard he claimed had spoken with Natalie that night, and then, when the moment came, was unable to find or identify him at all. Based on the guard claim, 2 former hotel security guards, men who had actually worked at a different hotel that was closed for renovations at the time, were arrested on June 5, 2005. Aruban Attorney General Karen Jansen
later explained that authorities had delayed taking the three young men into custody immediately, hoping instead that one of them would lead police directly to physical evidence. When that didn't happen, and the security guard's story couldn't be confirmed by anyone, the two guards were released 8 days later without charges, their lives disrupted by an accusation that led nowhere. Around the same time, investigators also arrested and released Vandersloot's own father, Paulus, along with a local party boat DJ, both of whom were briefly considered persons of interest before being let go for lack of evidence.
Each arrest, each release added another layer of confusion to an investigation that seemed to generate new leads almost as quickly as it eliminated them. Then on June 9, 2005, Joran Vandersloot and the Kalpoe brothers were formally arrested, held on suspicion of first or second-degree murder and kidnapping resulting in death. The first time all three of the last people confirmed to have seen Natalie alive were held in custody at the same time. Under continued questioning, the account given by Vandersloot and the Kalpoe brothers began to shift, each new version raising more questions than it answered. Satish Kalpoe eventually admitted he had lied in his initial statement. He revised his account, now claiming that he and his brother had dropped both Vandersloot and Natalie off together at her hotel, and that this was the last time either of them saw her, directly contradicting Vandersloot's own claim that he alone had walked her toward the hotel entrance.
But that new version of events ran into its own contradiction. A gardener at the Aruba Racket Club gave police a sworn statement that he had seen all three young men together in a car near the club at around 2:30 in the morning, a time when the Kalpoe brothers claimed they were already back home, and roughly the same window during which Vandersloot claimed he was walking Natalie into her hotel alone. Investigators searched the beach near the lighthouse on June 14th, looking for any physical trace of what might have happened there, digging through sand that, unbeknownst to them at the time, may have held the truth all along. The next day, they searched Vandersloot's family home, seizing 2 vehicles, computers, and cameras for forensic examination. Despite the shifting stories and the contradicting witness account, Aruban prosecutors ultimately determined they did not have enough hard evidence to hold any of the 3 men. A judge ordered their release later that year, citing insufficient evidence to support formal charges, a decision that stunned much of the American public following the case from thousands of miles away, watching the same 3 names appear in headlines again and again without ever facing trial. All 3 continued to deny any involvement in Natalie's disappearance. Vandersloot maintained the same core claim for years afterward, that he had simply dropped her off at her hotel and had no idea what happened to her after that. The case did not stay quiet for long, even without an arrest that stuck. Investigators in the Netherlands and Aruba continued digging in the background, even after the public spotlight had begun, inevitably, to dim. In April of 2007, investigators from the Netherlands spent 2 days digging around the Vandersloot family home without publicly revealing what had prompted the search. The following month, Dutch and Aruban investigators visited the home where Deepak and Satish Kalpoe lived with their parents for what authorities described only as an inspection, again without releasing further details to the public. Then, in November of 2007, more than 2 years after Natalie vanished, Aruban prosecutors rearrested all 3 men, citing what they described as new incriminating evidence uncovered during continued investigation. Vandersloot was taken into custody in the Netherlands, where he had been attending university. The Kalpoe brothers were arrested in Aruba. Investigators pointed to cell phone records and text messages exchanged between the 3 suspects around the time of Natalie's disappearance as part of the new evidence driving the rearrest, suggesting that whatever conversations had taken place between them that night, or in the hours afterward, had never been fully explained. For a moment, it looked like the case might finally move forward. Natalie's father, Dave Holloway, told reporters the news had renewed his hope that police might finally find real answers, calling it a sign that investigators were still actively working the case even years later. It didn't last.
Within days, a judge ruled that even this new evidence wasn't strong enough to justify continuing to hold the Calpo brothers, and they were released once again. Vandersloot remained in custody slightly longer, but he too was ultimately released without charges. Year after year, this same basic pattern repeated. New evidence would surface, hopes would rise, and then, without enough to secure an actual conviction, the case would quietly stall out again. Joran Vandersloot remained, in the eyes of nearly everyone following the case, the presumed killer of Natalie Holloway. And yet, somehow, he was never once convicted or even formally tried for her murder. Between the failed 2007 rearrest and the extortion scheme of 2010, Natalie's case settled into an uneasy limbo. It remained active, technically, on paper. Aruban prosecutors never formally closed the file. But with each passing year, the odds of new physical evidence surfacing after so much time in a tropical climate, on an island regularly battered by wind and rain, grew smaller and smaller. Beth Holloway refused to let the case fade quietly. She continued giving interviews, continued pushing for renewed searches, and continued publicly naming Joran Vandersloot as her daughter's killer, even without a conviction to back up the claim, a position that occasionally drew legal pushback from Vandersloot's own representatives, who maintained his innocence throughout. Vandersloot, for his part, seemed to grow increasingly comfortable discussing the case publicly, giving interviews in which he offered shifting, sometimes contradictory versions of that night, occasionally hinting at knowledge he claimed to have, only to walk the claims back later. Some of those public statements would later be used against him, painting a picture of a man who treated his own alleged crime as a subject for attention rather than something to be taken seriously. By 2010, 5 years after Natalie's disappearance, Vandersloot had moved to Peru, still never charged with any crime connected to her case, living a life largely removed from the intense scrutiny that had surrounded him back in Aruba in the Netherlands. That year, he made contact with Natalie's mother, Beth Holloway, with a proposition that struck at the very heart of everything her family had been searching for since 2005. In exchange for $250,000, he claimed he would reveal the exact location of Natalie's remains. He asked for $25,000 up front, with the rest to be paid once her body was positively identified, structuring the deal so that Beth Holloway would have no way to verify his claim without paying first. Beth Holloway, working with authorities who monitored the exchange, agreed to the arrangement. It represented, after 5 years of dead ends, a real chance, however slim, to finally bring her daughter home. Vandersloot accepted the initial payment. Then he admitted the entire story had been a lie. He had no idea where Natalie's remains actually were. He had simply invented the offer to extract money from a grieving mother who had spent 5 years searching for any real answer at all, exploiting the very desperation his own actions had created in the first place. It was, by any measure, one of the cruelest turns the case had taken yet, and it would soon become clear that it was not, by any measure, the last cruel thing Joran Vandersloot was capable of. Just weeks after that extortion attempt collapsed, on June 2, 2010, almost exactly 5 years to the day after Natalie Holloway disappeared, Joran Vandersloot killed a young Peruvian woman named Stephanie Flores in a hotel room in Lima, Peru. The two had met at a casino, and reports at the time indicated the killing occurred after Flores discovered information on Vandersloot's laptop connecting him to the Holloway case. Vandersloot fled Peru for Chile in the days after the murder, but was quickly located and arrested. He eventually pleaded guilty to Flores's murder. In court, prosecutors and the presiding judge would later draw a direct, damning line between the two cases. Years afterward, addressing Vandersloot directly in a different courtroom, Judge Anna Manasco put it bluntly. He had brutally murdered, in separate incidents years apart, 2 young women who had refused his advances. Vandersloot was sentenced to 28 years in prison in Peru for Flores's murder. In July of 2014, while incarcerated, he married a Peruvian woman in a ceremony held inside the maximum security prison where he was being held. He would spend the next decade plus of his life behind bars there, not for what he had done to Natalie Holloway, but for the second young woman he killed 5 years almost to the day after the first. For Natalie's family, the news of a second young woman's murder landed as a horrifying kind of vindication. The man they had believed for 5 years was responsible for their daughter's death had now killed again, in full view of the public, leaving no ambiguity about what he was capable of, even as the specific truth about Natalie herself remained locked away, unspoken. Stephanie Flores' own family, thousands of miles away in Peru, now found themselves bound to the Holloways by the same terrible circumstance. A daughter killed by the same man in 2 different countries, 5 years apart. For more than a decade, Joran Vandersloot remained in a Peruvian prison, and the truth about Natalie Holloway remained exactly where it had always been, locked inside his own account of that night, one he had changed and denied for years, told and retold in whatever version best served him at the time. That finally began to change in 2023. Federal prosecutors in the United States had never let go of the 2010 extortion case, the fake offer, the $25,000 payment, the lie about knowing where Natalie's body was, and pursued formal charges against Vandersloot connected to it, even while he remained locked away on an entirely different continent. On June 8, 2023, Vandersloot was extradited from Peru to the United States to face those extortion and wire fraud charges, a process that had taken years of coordination between American and Peruvian authorities. He arrived in Birmingham, Alabama, the very city where Natalie had grown up, 18 years after her graduation trip, the following day. One day after arriving, Vandersloot initially pleaded not guilty to the extortion and wire fraud charges. But as part of a negotiated plea agreement with federal prosecutors that followed, he ultimately agreed to plead guilty to those same charges, and, critically, to finally provide investigators and the Holloway family with a full, honest account of what had actually happened to Natalie 18 years earlier. In exchange, prosecutors agreed his confession would not be used to bring any new charges against him related to her death, effectively guaranteeing that whatever he said next could never put him on trial for Natalie's murder itself. Beth Holloway later explained the family's reasoning simply. After 18 years of silence, they wanted, more than anything else, the answers they had been searching for the entire time. It meant accepting that the man responsible would likely never be tried for the crime itself, a painful trade-off, but one the family judged worth making after nearly 2 decades with nothing at all.
It is worth pausing on exactly what the Holloway family had to accept in order to finally get an answer. Under the terms of the plea agreement, federal prosecutors explicitly agreed not to use Vandersloot's confession to bring any new charges against him for Natalie's death. In practical terms, that meant the family had to choose between 2 outcomes that had defined the entire 18 years of the case. Continue waiting, possibly forever, for evidence strong enough to convict him in open court, or trade away the possibility of that conviction in exchange for a guaranteed, detailed account of what actually happened. They chose the truth. It was not justice in the traditional sense. No trial, no jury verdict, no sentence handed down specifically for Natalie's murder. But after 18 years of arrests that led nowhere, evidence that was never quite enough, and a man who had lied to their faces about knowing where their daughter's body was, it was, for the Holloway family, the only form of certainty that had ever actually been within reach. On October 3, 2023, in an interview conducted by his own attorney and provided to federal authorities, Joran Vandersloot finally described what happened to Natalie Holloway on that beach in May of 2005, 18 years, 4 months, and 4 days after she disappeared. He said that after dropping off the Calpo brothers, he and Natalie had gone to the beach together, contradicting the story he had told police, reporters, and the public for nearly 2 decades. There, he said, things escalated when Natalie saw a text message on his phone from another woman and grew upset, a confrontation he claimed spiraled quickly out of control. According to his account, he struck her with a piece of cinder block he found nearby. "I smashed her head in with it completely," he told investigators. "Her face basically, collapses in. Even though it's dark, I can see her face is collapsed in." He said he then dragged her body into the ocean, wading in until he was roughly knee-deep before pushing her out into the water and walking home, leaving her in the same water Dutch Marines and volunteer divers had once searched, without success, for any trace of her at all. A detail that, for investigators who had led those very search efforts back in 2005, offered a bitter kind of clarity about just how close and how far those early searches had actually been. Natalie's remains were never recovered. Everything the world now knows about her final moments exists only because the man responsible finally chose, 18 years later, to say it out loud. On October 18, 2023, Joran Vandersloot appeared in federal court in Birmingham, Alabama, and formally pleaded guilty to the extortion and wire fraud charges connected to his 2010 scheme against Beth Holloway. Reporters packed the courthouse, and cameras were positioned outside for what many following the case had waited nearly 2 decades to see. Vandersloot, in an American courtroom, finally facing some form of accountability. In a victim impact statement delivered before sentencing, Beth Holloway confronted him directly, describing the years of pain and taunting his lies had caused her family, before telling him simply, "You look like hell." Judge Anna Manasco called the extortion and fraud charges heinous, noting that Vandersloot had known the information he sold to a grieving mother was a complete fabrication, designed purely for profit, a scheme that had deliberately preyed on a mother's desperation for closure. Vandersloot apologized to both the Holloway family and his own, telling the court, "I am no longer the person that I was." He agreed, as part of the plea deal, to continue assisting law enforcement and to submit to a polygraph examination regarding his account, giving investigators one further tool to test the truthfulness of what he had finally admitted. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison on the extortion and wire fraud charges, to be served concurrently with his existing 28-year sentence in Peru for the murder of Stephanie Flores. Because his sentence in Peru began first and runs alongside this one, Vandersloot is expected to remain incarcerated there until at least 2036, at which point he is expected to be extradited back to the United States to serve out the remainder of his sentence connected to Natalie's case. He has never been formally charged with Natalie Holloway's murder itself, and under the terms of the plea deal that finally produced his confession, he most likely never will be. Speaking to reporters immediately outside the federal courthouse after the hearing, Beth Holloway delivered the words her family had waited 18 years to say with any real confidence. "After 18 years, Natalie's case has been solved," she said. "Joran Vandersloot is the killer." In a separate statement, she reflected on the long road that had led to that moment. "It has been a very long and painful journey, but the persistence of many is going to pay off. Together, we are finally getting justice for Natalie." For a mother who had spent nearly 2 decades being told, again and again, that there simply wasn't enough evidence, hearing those words stated as settled fact in a federal courtroom represented a kind of closure that had once seemed entirely out of reach. It did not bring Natalie home. It did not give the family a grave to visit. But it gave them, finally, an answer they could stand behind with something close to certainty. And it gave them the standing, at last, to call Joran Vandersloot exactly what they had always believed him to be, without hedging, without qualification, and without fear of a defamation claim hanging over every word. Even with a confession finally on record, the case is not closed as neatly as the Holloway family might have once hoped. Vandersloot was never criminally charged with Natalie's murder, a direct result of the immunity built into the plea agreement that produced his confession in the first place. Aruban prosecutors, reviewing the new information after the confession became public, indicated it remained unclear whether he could still face murder charges on the island where the crime actually occurred, raising the faint possibility, still unresolved, that a courtroom reckoning specifically for Natalie's death could still happen somewhere down the line. T.J. Ward, a private investigator hired by the Holloway family in 2005 and again in 2010, has publicly stated he does not believe Vandersloot acted entirely alone that night, and that meaningful questions about the full circumstances of Natalie's death remain unanswered even now. His account, delivered years after his own investigation into the case, suggests the confession, however detailed, may still not represent the complete picture of what happened on that beach.
Natalie's remains have still never been found, meaning her family has never had a grave to visit, a funeral to hold, or a physical resting place to mark the end of 18 years of searching. Everything investigators and the public now know about her final hours rests on the word of the one man who spent 18 years lying about what happened to her. A man who has since demonstrated, through a second murder and a cruel extortion scheme, exactly how far he was willing to go, and exactly how little his word, on its own, has ever actually been worth. While Beth Holloway became the more prominent public face of the family's search, Natalie's father, Dave Holloway, pursued his own path toward answers, hiring private investigators over the years, including T.J. Ward, and pushing for continued attention from law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic. The couple, divorced since Natalie was a child, approached the tragedy from different angles, but with the same underlying goal, each contributing pressure that helped keep the case from disappearing entirely from public and official attention during the long years when no formal charges were ever filed. By the time Vandersloot's confession finally arrived in 2023, both parents had spent the better part of 2 decades in some form of active pursuit of the truth, never fully able to grieve in the ordinary way a family grieves a loved one, because there had never been a body, a funeral, or a definitive answer to grieve around. Looking back across the full 18 years, the delay in Natalie Holloway's case comes down to a frustrating legal reality rather than any lack of suspicion. Aruban authorities believed, almost from the very first week, that they knew who was responsible. But belief was never the same thing as proof. And without a body, without forensic evidence, and without a confession, prosecutors on the island simply never had enough to secure a conviction that would hold up in court. That gap between suspicion and proof gave Joran Vandersloot nearly 2 decades of freedom. Freedom he used first to extort a grieving mother, and then to kill again. It was only when American federal prosecutors found an entirely separate crime, one with its own solid evidence, its own paper trail, its own clear victim in Beth Holloway, that they finally had genuine leverage. The truth about Natalie didn't emerge because investigators finally cracked the original case. It emerged because Vandersloot's own greed, years later, created a second case prosecutors could actually win, and that case became the key that unlocked the first. Joran Vandersloot remains incarcerated in Peru today, serving his 28-year sentence for the murder of Stephanie Flores, with his 20-year American sentence for the Holloway extortion running alongside it. Barring any change, he is not expected to set foot on U.S. soil again until around 2036, meaning the man who took Natalie's life at 17 years old will likely spend nearly his entire adult life behind bars, even without ever being convicted of the crime that first made his name known around the world. Natalie Holloway's disappearance reshaped how an entire country talked about American travelers abroad, prompting years of advocacy from her mother, Beth, who founded the Natalie Holloway Resource Center to support other families of missing persons navigating cases that cross international borders, drawing on her own hard-won experience working with foreign governments, foreign legal systems, and foreign law enforcement agencies that owed her family nothing. The case inspired books, documentaries, and years of television coverage, keeping Natalie's name in the public consciousness long after most missing person cases quietly fade from view. For 18 years, the disappearance of a straight-A student from Alabama, gone in the final hours of a high school graduation trip, remained one of the most famous unsolved cases in the country. Not because there was no suspect, but because the presumed killer walked free, again and again, protected by exactly enough uncertainty to avoid a courtroom. 2 arrests, 2 releases,
A cruel, calculated extortion scheme. A second murder, almost to the day, 5 years later. And finally, after 18 years, 4 months, and 4 days, an admission that changed nothing about his freedom and everything about what the world now knows.
In the end, it was not new forensic evidence or a body finally recovered from the ocean that closed the case. It was a plea deal born out of an unrelated crime committed against Natalie's own mother. One final, calculated con from a man who, 18 years earlier, had also very nearly gotten away with everything, and who, in the end, was only ever truly caught for the crimes he committed after Natalie Holloway.